So, welcome back, everyone, to these Europe Day events here at the House of European History. We're working with the Europe Stories Project of Oxford University with Timothy Garton Ash, who is now in the audience with us today. I am in awe to be with Timothy. He's a columnist and author, The Guardian, all kinds of books. History of Europe, and he's been coordinating the events today so far, the panels that have been on Europe Social and Green and a Europe Democratic and Free. And now we are going to talk to the same panelists that we saw today, but to get each of their takes on what to do in these next few years. Then we will go Q&A with them and with you as well here in the audience, and those of you who are connected on YouTube. There's a YouTube chat. You can put in your questions and comments there. We'll get to them, as many of them as we can. And then keep in mind also, hashtag Tweet Like a Beast, please. Hashtag Europe Day. Hashtag Europe Stories. Hashtag Europe Stories. Anything you would like to cast wider on this, and there will be many points made that we should cast wider. And why? One of them is because, of course, today is the anniversary of the end of World War II, but tomorrow is Europe Day because that was the signing of the Schuman Declaration that paved the way for the European Union, and tomorrow is when the Future of Europe Conference results go to the EU institutions, the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission on what, after sounding out for 6 months from Europeans like you, what you want to see Europe do in these next few years. So let us begin with Kristijan Fidanovski, Oxford University. You have done publications on EU integration, on bilateral disputes, on conspiracy theories, nationalism in the Western Balkans. Fascinating. Now, with that background, what would you like to see the European be and do for you in these next few years?
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. And if I'm wearing multiple hats, then I guess I can keep my recommendations more diverse. But I mainly contributed to the social policy chapter of our report, so I would like to start with two social policy-related recommendations for the EU. So the first one is probably a little more prosaic. Of course, the fundamental concern of social policy scholars is always one of the fundamental concerns, the minimum wage and how high it should be set. The struggle currently is to get it to at least 50% of the average wage in EU member states. Mm-hmm. Of course, currently only 2 countries have 60% or higher, France and Portugal. 6 countries in the EU don't have a minimum wage at all at the national level: Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Italy, Austria, and Cyprus. This is not equally problematic in all of them because, of course, the Scandinavian countries have strong collective bargaining at different sectors, so it's less of a problem there, but it's still a priority in terms of social policy. And then the second one would be a little more bold, perhaps, but the EU has already been bold in this regard in the past, so it's just about returning to that previous level. I'm referring to the European Globalization Adjustment Fund, a major EU initiative, which used to be more generous when it started a few years ago. Now it has been cut dramatically. And it's intended to help displaced workers, very broadly defined workers who have been displaced because of globalization, who have either lost their job or who have had to switch sectors. So it's intended to help them retrain and acquire a new position that is more adequate for their skills.
So you'd like to see that expanded then?
I would like to see that expanded.
Okay.
And I would like the generosity to go back to its previously higher level. And then finally, I would perhaps take off my social policy hat now and talk about enlargement a little bit, because as I mentioned in the previous panel, I'm from North Macedonia, which is a candidate country, and has been a candidate country for EU accession for 17 years
For too long, right.
Way too long. So one thing that we can do about that is to advocate for removing the unanimity when it comes to European Union accession and enable current EU member states to decide on a fairer, I would argue, basis in terms of admitting new members. Because as long as it is possible for any one EU member states to block the entire accession process of candidate countries, it will be politically problematic, not only for the Western Balkans, but also in the future, perhaps for Ukraine and any other countries that would like to join.
Okay, very good. Perfect. 3 minutes. Excellent. Great. If we can all stay at 3 minutes, that would be fantastic. So we can get to the Q&A. Marnie Howlett, lecturer of politics at Oxford. You have worked centers on nationalism, on borders, geopolitics, political cartography within the former Soviet Union, specifically Ukraine, because you have Ukrainian roots. You're Canadian, but you're Ukrainian roots. I have an American accent, but my mother was French, and I am a French citizen as well, so just so you know. And I have 2 teenage youth who are joined at the hip by what we're talking about today.
No,
but anyway, enough of me.
Thank you for the very lively introduction. I'm going to come at this also with 2 hats. So one being a Ukrainian Canadian, and the second being a political scientist. So I was not part of the report, as we talked about. However, when I read it, there's one sentence that really stood out to me, and this is near the end. And the quote was, "The most important thing that the EU should achieve by 2030 is to stay together." And as a political scientist and as someone who studies geopolitics, this is really interesting, and it points to many questions, specifically within the global context in which we're in right now, but also within the last 5 to 10 years. And I think what I would like to see with the EU going forward by 2030, perhaps sooner, is to understand what it is itself, what it stands for. Yeah. So we had questions asked with Brexit, if it's any longer an economic institution, if it's, if it is about the common market, which it once was established as. We've seen with the pandemic some questions, like we talked about this morning, around the values, whether this be socially, democratically, around the environment. Many questions are asked there, but now with Ukraine, we have other questions to ask of what is the role of the EU in the world. How does it stay together, and how do we define it? Both from the outside, for Ukrainians, how do they see it? How do other acceding members, or hopefully acceding members, how do they see it? And how does the EU itself define itself as an entity within global politics? I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully we can talk about this more largely.
So you've raised the questions, but how would you like to see it, though?
How would I like to see it? I would like to see it having a stronger role within, we talked about earlier, with being a global power. I think we can say that it is a global power, but I don't think it serves the economic or the strong hard power role that perhaps it wants to. But I think that it could be a very strong soft power geopolitical entity, in the fact that it could really shape norms and values, not only within the European continent, but I think much of what we see here, as a Canadian, much of what we see happening in Europe does trickle over to North America. I'm sure you could speak about it yourself. But I think that we do mimic, and we do really aspire to what the EU is trying to do, what they are trying to uphold, and so specifically around democracy, but also in terms of other values like the environment, Canada in particular.
Setting regulations.
Exactly.
GDPR and data protection, for instance, has had an influence around the world, right?
Exactly. So I think that the conversation today has been very centered on Europe and what Europeans see it, but I think it is really important to consider what the EU represents beyond the continent, not only just in the neighborhood of countries, but also in terms of the other side of the world. We very much aspire to follow in its footsteps and uphold the same values that it is representing. And I think that's exactly what it needs to do going forward.
Excellent, Marnie. Thank you. Ana Martins, bom dia, ex-Oxford, and now Catholic University of Portugal, is that right? Europe's Stories Project, as many of you have been working on, research on perceptions of democratic participation and belonging in the EU. So with that in context, what would you like to see happen? How would you like to see the EU?
Okay, so first of all, I share the same perspective. For me, the European Union clarifying what it wants to be. We've had our history so far, but I think we're now living through defining moments, and we need to be clear on what it should be. I think especially its geopolitical position and how it wants to be positioned in this new geopolitical order is
how much
crucial.
It should assert itself. right?
Yes, also in accordance with its core values, what sort of, in the spirit of what Marnie was saying about the fact that the EU already exercises its soft power and sets an example on the sorts of solutions that it would like to see pursued. So be that sort of agent and fully acknowledge it. There was a policy recommendation I was going to share, but I don't know if I've already...
Yeah, go for it. No, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so I conducted about a quarter of the qualitative interviews, and something that became very clear to me was that people who had an exchange experience, a student exchange experience, a travel experience, were related to the European Union differently than people who hadn't had that, even though they were very pro-EU. But this is only my perception, by the way. This is not a finding from our project, but from my personal perspective, I could see a clear difference, whereas people who didn't have a student exchange experience, for instance, tended to regard the EU more like a mutually beneficial agreement, more than something that we're a part of, and has a certain meaning beyond just its benefits.
So what gives it that meaning is actually living and experiencing that either through Erasmus or this idea, I think in the Future of Europe they're proposing, that all youth at 18 get an Interrail pass.
Exactly.
That's been that sort of pilot project for a few thousand people.
That's Discover EU.
But
so that sort of project.
Yeah.
And I just want to highlight that this seems like a luxury and a very insignificant bit of policy, but I think everyone now acknowledges that Erasmus was an extraordinarily impactful policy. And so going forward, it's not just the European Union at the supranational level understanding what it is, it's also the member states understanding what they're part of and that having full meaning, not just acknowledgement of the benefits.
I might just, it rings a bell that in the Europe Stories videos, because I've watched a number of them, one of my colleagues that I worked with at Euronews when I had my talk show, Monica Elena, she is one of those on Europe Stories, and she said that one of the most influential things that she lived through was through Erasmus. That's what gave her a better grasp and concept of what Europe is all about. So I thought that was a very interesting one of the Europe's stories. So we want to encourage people to go over there to the booth. Those of you here, please go in the booth, as I have done, and give your 5 answers to your concept of Europe and where it should go. Lilia Antoniuk, you're doing your PhD on constitutional law, is that right, at the University of Kiev. And you've been managing Young European Ambassadors Network in Ukraine, which aims to empower young Ukrainians, and the NGO Women's League, Girls Leadership Academy, all getting Ukrainians to think more European, I guess. That's part of it. So how do you see this? And of course, in the context of the conflict that we're struggling with right now, how do you see, what should Europe be doing in these next few years?
This is indeed quite interesting and challenging question.
3 points.
Yes, so I will try, I work for the communication project, and in communications, there's the notion of keys, keep it short and sweet. Yes. So I will try at least to keep it short. I'm not sure that it will be sweet. From a Ukrainian perspective, indeed, we would like the European Union to have strong common defense and security policy in order to defend itself and its neighbors as well. Because if you are having European neighborhood policy and you're committed to it, then there should be some strong mechanisms in support of that. The second element is actually the issue of being stronger, but from some, more operational part. European Union is usually criticized because it is a bit, too bureaucratic. The mechanism, the machine itself, it takes too long. So it would be great if some new mechanisms are introduced within the EU, within this machine, actually to make it a bit faster.
Like, for instance?
To have some kind of simplified procedures of taking the decisions.
Majority vote.
Sorry?
Majority vote as opposed to
as opposed to unanimity, yes,
okay.
Indeed, indeed. And my third point will correspond actually to some points which were mentioned about the enlargement. I do believe that, especially at the current moment, the issue of enlargement is a crucial one. So I hope and I trust in the European Union and in the EU citizens that it will be possible for them in the nearest future to consider this issue, to reconsider this issue of enlargement. I'm not talking about some simplified criteria, but some procedural issues should be dealt with. Thanks.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Thank you very much. Let's move to Jan Farfal. Jan, dzień dobry. Oxford, Europe Stories you've been working on, researching how emigre journalists address their home societies behind the Iron Curtain. That's very intriguing for me as a journalist of a long time. And in that context, how do you see, and as a Polish citizen, how do you see, what should Europe be doing in these next few years?
Well, I mean, we already talked about the geopolitical union, about what European Union should be about in the outer world, but I certainly want to subscribe to this notion as well that I want Europe to assume its agency in the world. And I think that one idea to put it forward would be a notion present in our chapter on Europe in the world, which is this green civilian superpower. The chapter was penned by Mariana Lovato and Olivier Defrun. And what do we mean by this green civilian superpower? As we already discussed, there was a reluctance of young Europeans to see traditional global power politics. And there was a preference for climate, education, health, human rights, fighting poverty. So our idea was to externalize the inner values rather than to internalize the external ones.
And so specifically, how do you do that? Through regulation, or like we talked about GDPR, like about environmental regulations? Is that what you mean?
I think that this is certainly a way forward. So this could be asserted through our trading links, through our negotiations, and also through promotion of credits and investments abroad. And obviously there are a lot of questions associated. You rightly pointed out, how can it be done? So clearly the war in Ukraine is showing the limits of being a civilian superpower in a global context. How do we talk with a brute force? But even with relation to climate change, there are a lot of challenges ahead. So how do we promote the Green Deal as our foreign policy, ensuring that Europe does not become a green island within a very polluted world, because we need to show a solidarity across the globe as well. But European Union was always about challenging and ambitious ideas, and I think that this green civilian superpower should also be entertained.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Let's move finally to Sophie Vériter, national researcher at the University of Leiden, wonderful school in Holland. I've been there. Ex-Oxford, worked in the Eastern Partnership countries where you launched and coordinated the Young European Ambassadors Initiative. And so, in that context, what would you like to see Europe doing in these next few years?
Yep, thank you. I'm going to have 3 points that follow up on what we discussed in the previous panel on democracy.
Great.
The first one is to have a democracy that is more deliberative, direct, and involving normal citizens, right? So I already mentioned that before, that we feel that democracy is not enough anymore to be voting every other year, especially at the EU level, where there is a huge disconnect. So first, I want to see more simple and more accessible citizens' initiative, in addition to what already exists. And I want to see civic education and media literacy, including in the program of schools throughout Europe.
Okay, good
That's
point.
the first point.
Okay.
The second point is about the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was good, but a missed opportunity to make it something really groundbreaking. So I want the EU to work now on the next Conference on the Future of Europe, but actually leave it in the hands of the young generation, which is the future of Europe, and civil society. So not a top-down exercise, but a real bottom-up exercise.
Okay, let me follow up on that because I've been interviewing many MEPs over just across the park over here at the European Parliament, where they contended that they were making a great effort to involve people in the grassroots, to be in these different conferences and events, but what I was also hearing was that there was a lack of interest on the public side.
Yeah.
So how would you have fixed that?
Yeah. Well, you let the people who decide what's interesting to them make it interesting for people like them.
Okay.
Because the problem was that the Conference on the Future of Europe was designed by people who are not young people, right? If you make it an exercise that it sounds like, even the name to me is a mistake. The Conference on the Future of Europe does not sound appealing to the majority of people.
So what would you say? What would you call it?
I don't know, the Festival of Europe, something like that. People want to go to a festival. Do most people want to go to a conference? I don't think so.
It's not a bad idea. Not a bad idea.
Anyway, there are many ways of making it appealing, but for that you need to speak with young people themselves and let them decide what's interesting to them.
Yeah.
Right?
That's true.
And then the third point that I want to make is to have more pan-European initiatives, right? So you mentioned the Young European Ambassadors, which is a great project we launched a few years ago. It's fantastic to see that it keeps growing and expanding, and now Lilia is part of it. And actually, I was kind of shocked when I was working on that initiative to see that the EU was so much more active in promoting and engaging with people and informing and raising awareness outside of its borders. Is there something like a Young European Ambassadors initiative in Europe? No. So I think we need more of these initiatives that connect people, right? And I completely agree with what Anna said about traveling. So this is why we think that there should be an Interrail pass for everybody. And there was in the past an opportunity to get an Interrail if you turned 18, but you had to apply. It was only valid for 1 year.
Yeah, it's a happy few. Yeah, exactly.
It makes it more complicated, so let's just make it easy for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Very good, and I think this idea about transnational voting lists, because I think that's very interesting, because too often what we're seeing over there in the Parliament is everybody's thinking tribal, everybody's thinking about their backyard and not on a European level. That's always the problem, and hopefully that would solve, but in so doing, you need to have those kinds of programs where people are getting together and talking on a European level through that ambassadors program, through Erasmus, through even just traveling with the Eurail Pass. So, before I go to questions here, maybe I can get some quick feedback from Timothy from these different ideas. What's your reaction to all those ideas?
This is a terrific series of suggestions. I'm tempted to say slightly immodestly that while the European institutions were getting their act together on the Conference on the Future of Europe, we had a little Conference on the Future of Europe in Oxford, and we came up with the idea of an Interrail pass for every European when they turned 16 automatically. So you heard it here first. That's point number one. Point number two, I think it's a really interesting question, which we've been discussing all day, whether the war in Ukraine really is a formative moment for Europeans, or only for those Europeans who experienced it directly themselves. Because all this emphasis on direct personal experience. Point number three, and this is maybe we can talk a bit further, what would it actually take to have the EU as a hard power? To have a genuine EU defense and security policy, right? So war comes to Europe, I mean the war in Ukraine. What do? We all turn to the United States. We turn to NATO. That's a reality. That's a hard power reality. So what would we take, and are we really ready to do it?
Yeah, that is a big question, and it's not only in terms of coordinating armies, but coordinating the procurement of weaponry as well. That's a big issue as well. Would anyone like to, among the panel, like to address that? What it would take to become a hard power? Yes, Sophie.
I can start by not really answering the question, but by adding that I was just talking about that earlier with Jan. That superpower, yes. And it's not just about security in terms of hard power, right? Because security as a concept is something that is constantly evolving. And today we can put climate change in the security basket, something that perhaps we couldn't have done 20 years ago. So when I think of Europe as a superpower for a safe Europe, I also think of security in broader terms. And I think, like we did the exercise a bit before to see how people respond to the wording as well, that a superpower in itself rings a bell of tanks and military, but if you say, a green superpower, a green civilian superpower, then people are much more willing to engage with that idea.
Yeah, I might just interject that I sounded out my two kids, 14 and 17. What would you like to see the EU doing in these next few years, by 2030? Yeah. Climate, carbon neutrality. They want to see carbon neutrality by 2030. Not 2050, 2030. Yeah.
Well, another dimension to this broader question about the European security, and in particular the relation between Europe and America, is the point about young Europeans being driven by the values and perceiving European Union as a union of values. And apparently, when it comes to trade policy, 50% of young Europeans feel that our trading policy is aligned with American interests. But when it comes to values, it's only 20%. So we need to be also prepared to foresee the potential divergence of those values happening. And this will be an enormous challenge in the future.
Okay, yes, Celia.
So actually, just to continue this issue of values and commenting on the first question on whether the war in Ukraine will be the formative moment, not only for Ukrainians, but for Europeans, for citizens with the EU passport. I believe that yes, and why? Because more than 5 million Ukrainians were forced to flee the country. So now, in different EU member states, 5 million Ukrainians have found their homes, new temporary homes. In some cases, they are participating in the governmental programs. In some cases, they are living in the houses of ordinary Europeans who actually have no connection to Ukraine, have no relatives, nothing connected to Ukraine, but who saw the war, who saw that something is going on wrong, and just proposed their support. So it means that even if you are directly not affected, and by directly I mean that you were not wanted, you haven't lost anyone from your family, your property is okay, you were not forced to leave your country. But here, walking on the streets of Brussels, you hear Ukrainian language more and more often. So it was not like that before the 24th of February. You can meet people who will say you, well, I'm now hosting a Ukrainian family at my home. And then you become to consider it. Why is it going on, and what is happening? And I do believe that for many Europeans, this will be also the formative moment.
I think it is also influenced in terms of defense. It has influenced in the Nordics the will to countries that have been outside of NATO to want to join NATO. I think that shows a will for Europe to become more assertive in terms of defense. Yes.
Yes, I'd
please.
like to address this question about what would a European superpower look like, and also with the caveat that superpower has the connotations it does. First of all, the European Union is an experiment in a globalized order where international organizations increasingly need to play a role for interests to be negotiated and have a proper setting for that to happen. And it's a unique experiment. It could pave the way for future similar experiments in other continents and at other levels of governance. Right. And we've just seen, and we've discussed this morning, the EU kind of prove one of the main criticisms about it wrong, which is it does not have the capability for effective action. It can't coordinate. It can't really achieve the results it's supposed to achieve. And we saw that with the pandemic, the response to the pandemic, and now we saw that with the Ukraine war.
There has been some divergence on certain things, right?
That's fair, but we've seen a level of action
sanctions, for instance.
we've seen a level of action that arguably is unprecedented in the EU's history.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay,
that's true.
So at least we've seen the potential for capability and how bureaucracy, even though it certainly exists and is a hindrance to progress, it can also be overcome to achieve results when the matter is urgent and the sense of threat is real.
Yeah.
So what does this say about what the European Union could be? I think that it should be construed, or its role should be to have an influential role, an effective role, and kind of lead the way, again, as a soft power it has been thus far, for how we should coordinate on an international level the challenges of a globalized order.
Do we have any questions or comments out here in the audience that anybody would like to make a statement on what you've heard so far about the objectives? Yes, please. Yeah, if you could give your name and
I'm
title.
Sophie. I live in Brussels, so I had a quick question about you mentioned that there was a coordination about the pandemic, apart from the vaccination, which of course was a massive step. We've never seen vaccination on such a massive scale. Mm-hmm. How do you feel that the EU was able to coordinate? Because nobody had the same rule for border closing. Nobody had the same rule for self-isolation. Nobody had the same rule. I don't know, in France, for example, you were not allowed to leave your home for more than 1 hour, more than 1 kilometer away, which is completely insane. In Brussels, you were walking in the streets on a Sunday. It felt like there was no pandemic. So I don't really see how you can explain that there was a coordination during the pandemic, because yes, on a health level there was, and I think this was the first time that the EU coordinated on health. But apart from that, I didn't see the coordination at all.
Yeah, isn't it tricky though that it's because health is not within the purview of the EU. It is a national issue, and that is why we sort of had to write the script as we progressed, right? Would someone like to maybe not be too forgiving either? Maybe this makes a case for a health union, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. So we can discuss all kinds of levels of cooperation, right? I like to often remind people that I'm not pro-federation or anti-federation. I just think that the notion of federation does not involve the level of integration that is often thought. We should be reminded that most countries, most states in Europe are actually federations, and that there is a level of autonomy that you can have that is compatible with a level of cooperation on a superior level. So, an interregional level and so on. So that is a great and important question. And I do think that there should be a considerable level of autonomy among countries. The issue is you need institutions to coordinate on common interests, right? And we did, and I agree entirely that it was a convoluted process and it had many setbacks and so on. But what we could see is a potential for coordination on common interests via the institutions that we've established. And for instance, the EU Recovery Fund, I think, is another good example of how we've coordinated.
Yeah,
and how
700
we've
billion.
helped each country out.
Yeah, exactly. Kristijan, let me, can I come to you on the issue of wages? That's another issue that that goes beyond what the EU can actually do. So are you suggesting that in terms of wages, that somehow that be determined at an EU level?
Yes, I mean, part of the problem is, as you also alluded, that these issues are often national, prerogatives. So that's probably, inevitable.
Yeah, taxation too. That's another issue.
Absolutely. Yeah. Of course, we're not talking about the same amount for all member states, but if we're defining the minimum wage as a percentage of the average wage, then I think there should absolutely be an EU mandated minimum level.
Minimum.
Now we can talk about whether it should be 45% or 50%. We can negotiate over the technicalities, but there has to be some standard. in that
Somehow
regard.
pegged to the cost of living in each respective country, perhaps, too, right? Something
Well,
like that.
yes, in terms of the absolute amount, but relatively speaking, I think there can be an EU-level threshold. I would just like to add that those of us who are focused on more sort of domestic issues often notice that both social policy and public health are often neglected at the EU level. And when it comes to the health commissioner, for example, anecdotally, people always say that it's the least in-demand commissioner position at the European Union. At least that was the case before the pandemic. We'll see if that might change now. And it's unfortunately similar for social policy.
Right. Any other questions out here before I go to one of mine? Okay, and also though, for those of you watching on YouTube, you can put it in the chat. Any kind of comment or question, please feel free. Let me move to back to Marnie about how to define the EU. Can you go a little bit more into that and reflecting what youth want? How should the EU be defined? Can you give a couple concrete examples?
Yeah, well, I think already just in this conversation, we've already highlighted
exactly
some of these really important issues, right? We're talking about, global health challenges, whether this be a pandemic, future pandemics, or other issues.
Yeah.
We're talking about the environment, even wages, salaries, cost of living. Many of these are tangible things, but they expand beyond boundaries of states. They cannot be regulated. We can look at salaries definitely, but when you're in a larger union, you have to recognize that there are some issues that expand beyond the boundaries of your individual state. And that is the sole purpose of coming together as a union. And if you're not prepared to address those issues, then there are fundamental problems, right? And in the report, near the end, there is a question about, or I guess a comment that comes about as the EU being a community of values in a globalizing or an evolving world. And if this is the case, what we're kind of highlighting here is that it may be so, but it's not ready to address some of these issues of the globalizing world. And going forward by 2030, or perhaps as soon as possible, is that it needs to realize that what it was and what it was created for is not prepared to address, or hasn't been prepared yet. And perhaps these have been a really good starting point, thinking of ways that we address public health issues when we're forced to do so, but the fore-planning perhaps hasn't been there yet. And maybe Ukraine is a really critical juncture, if you will say, as a way for us to realize that the EU is not at the place it should be, and that if it wants to be able to address these challenges going forward, it really needs to define not only itself, but putting some of these measures and policies in place, because it seems it's kind of lacking where it could be right now.
You have the sense that European youth would like to see more central authority within the EU to be able to address key issues like health, labor, wages, education, right?
I don't want to advocate for a central authority, also because I'm not a citizen of an EU country.
Okay.
However, I would say that we're highlighting issues here that are either expanding beyond an individual state. Climate change is not something any single state in the world can address unilaterally. It has to be collectively, whether this be from a union, from the United Nations, whatever it is, it has to be a collective of nations or states coming together to address some of these. A pandemic is another example.
Okay.
And so with this, whether this be a more centralized authority or whether this just be greater collaboration at the state level with the union, with other international organizations, these are questions we need to ask.
Yeah,
however, there needs
absolutely.
to be some different levels of organization.
Yeah, there are sensitivities out there about, does this feel like superstate here, or do we need to some degree to have more authority at the center to be able to address common issues that we share across the EU? It's a tough question, and to know what youth feel about that, Sophie.
Yes, in the report that we wrote, and based on the interviews that we did, we realized, and also the polling, that young people, young Europeans value output efficiency more than the process in many, many, many spheres, including, and most importantly, emergency themes such as climate change.
Yeah.
So I think if we present it like that to the young generation, that look, there's going to be a bit of a more centralized process, but things are going to get done quicker.
Yeah, if you can make that case in a concrete way.
Yeah. Then I think.
How do you do that then? Can you give an example?
Well, I think the polling that we did showing that 53% of 53% of young Europeans believe that authoritarian states are more adapted than democracies to tackle the climate crisis.
That's kind of scary, isn't it?
Yes, speaks of itself, because they believe that authoritarian states have the capacity to deal with things more urgently.
So more central authority kind of follows along that way.
Exactly.
Though democratically elected, of course.
The problem is that at the national level, national politicians, when something goes wrong, tend to blame it on the central level, on the EU, even when it has nothing to do with EU competences. Yeah. So there is a responsibility as well at the national level to be explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. Timothy, please, yes.
Can I just jump in here, because I think if asking the question, is it more centralization, is a sort of, in a way, if you don't mind my saying so, it's a classic Brussels way of posing the question, which is to come at it from the wrong end, because what you have to start with is, what do we actually want to do in the world? And if you think where the European Union was just before it became the European Union, right, 1992, it had huge strategic ambition. Think of the enormous projects we had. Single market to complete, monetary union, Schengen, free movement, which we so much value, huge program of enlargement, and we already said common foreign and security policy. We didn't do all that much about it. So 5 huge strategic ambitions. So one way to pose the question back to the panel is, what are our great strategic ambitions for the next 30 years? So, you know, absolutely the green agenda, world leading on addressing the climate crisis, would certainly be one. In my book, but I don't want to answer for the panel, but another one would be a really ambitious agenda of enlargement, that we as the European Union should want the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia and Belarus, when they become democracies, in the case of Belarus, we should want them to be members of the European Union. It's our ambition, not just theirs. And if one could find, you know, 2 or 3 other major strategic goals with a, you know, 15 to 30 year time frame, that I think is how you start answering the question. And only then do you go to the institutional questions of, you know, what do we then need to achieve that?
Right. Set the goals and then the means.
But perhaps we can take that back to the panel.
Yeah, please. Yes. Yes. Lillian.
Yes, so just maybe to back up a little bit. So it happened that I'm not the member of this great research, but I just opened it, and it happened that it is opened on the page 84, and I see here the information about the European Union citizens and their approach to how much EU should be involved in the global affairs and what should be the role of the EU in terms of the global affairs and arena. And as the research was based on EU 28 still, 80% of respondents mentioned that they would like to see EU, that EU is more active on the global arena and is a real power if we talk about this strategic and if we talk about this international arena and relations. So if it is already like 80% of people who believe that EU should play more significant role than it should be done in such a case, this is the opinion of people. This is not the opinion of like only one person who is out of the European Union. So I do believe that this is the aim which should be further developed and supported by the institutions as well.
Okay. Yes, Jan.
Yeah, just to jump on the data with 80% of Europeans supporting. Well, as usual, the devil is in the details. So it's 80% in general, but we also need to acknowledge those small differences and preferences of certain states, such as Ireland, for example, or Austria, which always tend to be less keen on any international involvement.
Okay.
But I just would like to point about the recent publication of EU Strategic Compass. So, I mean, there are certain long-term strategic objectives that the European Union is prepared to pursue. Obviously, is the question whether those objectives will be met or not. But the crucial word in this document is resilience, which I think appears more than 40 times. So Europe which is resilient, Europe which can actively engage in certain ways. So this is for the foreign policy. Another aspect of foreign policy addressed by Timothy when it comes to enlargement, I mean, I guess it's not a great discovery to say if we cannot integrate Western Balkans in the Union, then what are we talking about here? I mean, there are those new distressing polls coming from Serbia, for example, because you, Kristijan, mentioned that, well, in Northern Macedonia, it's still 70%. Well, in Serbia, there was this distressing poll that it's roughly below 50% already. So we see a huge disillusionment with those enlargement processes. Obviously, we should treat this poll with a pinch of salt because the mood can change. And there are a lot of things for which we should blame the way European Union behaved as well. But this is an indicative that it's time to make some action. And we're losing this time.
Kristijan, yeah, I was going to ask you, about that. And also, as a North Macedonian, how do you make the case to a fellow youth in the EU saying, yeah, you should let us in? What do you tell them? Why?
Yes, so, well, a couple of things there. First, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is really a structural problem. So as long as unanimity is required in every single step of accepting a new member state, there will be issues. Right now, it's Bulgaria blocking North Macedonia. Tomorrow, it might be Croatia blocking Serbia.
And it used to be Greece.
It used to be Greece.
Yeah.
If Serbia joins the EU before other Western Balkan countries join, then Serbia might be blocking, of course, Kosovo, etc., etc. It's a never-ending cycle because, unfortunately, that's how domestic politics works. And speaking of that, Emmanuel Macron, for example, has often been cast as the big villain in this story because between Greece and Bulgaria, it was France blocking North Macedonia's accession. And sorry to be picking on France, but domestic public opinion in France has unfortunately been demanding this. So I don't think it's fair to blame this solely on Macron because he's merely responding to very natural domestic political pressures. And tomorrow it might be another politician from another member state because public opinion, Jan, maybe you know more about this than I do, but tends to be against enlargement in many EU member states. So what else can I say about this? Well,
but how do you make that argument to fellow youth in the EU that it is in your interest to let us in?
Yeah, well, we touched on this at the previous panel as well. It's a very important question, and there's a very pragmatic case to be made as well. It's not just about the idealistic case and how it's about the idea of a Europe whole and free, etc., etc. Yeah. Pragmatism should come in as well because, of course, the advantages of getting the cheaper labor force from these countries. Some products can also be cheaper if trade relations are improved.
Well, the Balkans are 20 million consumers too.
Right? Absolutely. Not all politicians want more labor force from other countries. So there is, again, a political obstacle there. But the economic case is there to be made. So it's not only about values.
Right, right. Yes, please, Anna.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to challenge Timothy's framing of the question, which was, if I recall correctly, we need to know what we want to achieve in order to address the questions of how we should organize and so on. And I'm not sure I agree with that because I think we need to define the purpose, the point of this union first, because challenges will come along. We didn't expect a pandemic. We didn't expect, well, some didn't expect this war to happen. And we don't know what's coming down the pipe. Actually, the world seems increasingly unpredictable. So I think we need to be very clear on what the purpose of the union is. And to me, that is we're a group of countries with a lot of shared history, a lot of shared values. We agree on the fundamentals of how our societies should be organized. And then we have local interests that are more specific when we look just within the EU, but they tend to be more common when we look from an outside stance. So our place in the world. So I think we really need to get clear on that. And I think there are multiple ways to go about it, but we need to get clear on it. And I think that we were on that path. We had those strategic objectives. I think it was about around the time of the financial crisis that we started losing the momentum, and doubts just polluted the whole I don't know, public perception of the EU. And it just chilled things down. And so I think we've just lived with delaying these important questions for a while now. And now the time has come because global challenges are upon us. We can recognize very clearly right now what our common interests are. And we have this unique opportunity. And by the way, I should stress, it's an amazing experiment, the EU. We criticize the EU for its failures, which it undoubtedly has, but for an unprecedented experiment, it has gone extraordinarily well. So there's a lot of potential to build on here and to go forward. Obviously, we need to correct things along the way. Yeah.
Sophie, please.
Yes, I just wanted to add something on the enlargement question and yeah, how do we convince people to let new members in? And indeed, the problem is that European leaders have been blocking this. Why? Because they represent the interest of their voters, and they're not going to do something that is against the majority of public opinion. So the problem is, in my perspective, public opinion. And why would public opinion be against enlargement? Because they are afraid of migration, and that fear of migration is related to racism, let's be honest. And second of all, because they're afraid that their quality of life is going to be negatively impacted by this. They're afraid of losing their jobs. They're afraid that economic conditions are going to be negatively impacted. So the EU needs to be a better job about communicating about this specifically and communicating about these areas, that what is exactly going to change if we do get Macedonia in. How will your quality of life be affected? How will migration be affected?
Yeah, why is it, and why is it in your interest as well? Because I think some governments and voters are worried about how much it's going to cost as well, right? After the Big Bang of 2004. Yes, please. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, just relating to what Anna said, that apart from the strategic objectives, we also need to know what to do. So, like to borrow your phrase, Timothy, when we say we are supposed to be self-critical fighters, we also should be self-conscious fighters. So obviously there is this need to accommodate both the objectives, but also the knowledge of who we are and how we operate. And I guess we are now on the second stage of the project, which is called Europe in the Changing World. So we will try to address this also through the prism of how others perceive Europe. So just wait a few more months for our results. But also to what Sophie mentioned, and within the broader aspect of this discussion about enlargement and people being afraid that those newcomers will come after jobs and social provisions. Well, there was this very interesting statement from one of the seminars that we did on Europe in a Changing World, that actually when it comes to Western Balkans or Turkey, for example, you didn't allow our countries to join EU, but we entered it anyway. So if you see, for example, the population of Western Balkans living and working in Austria and in Vienna in particular, correct me if I'm wrong, Kristijan, but is it more than 200,000 citizens already of ex-Yugoslavs? Germany to follow as well. So perhaps if we start from this point, showing that a lot of those potential member states countries are already, the citizens of the member states candidates are already here, well integrated, then we
contributing to society through their work and through
indeed. So then we can rephrase this discussion. And if we do it this way, then, for example, the discussion about potential Ukrainian accession, when we have now more than 4 million refugees already in Europe,
right? That's true.
Might gain a new perspective.
Lily.
Thanks. So actually, I would like to refer to the issue of quality of life. And I believe that many Europeans have some stereotypes which are related to that, because in practice it is not only European Union which can give something to the countries, neighboring countries, but there's a lot of things which neighboring countries can actually share with the European Union. And I will just now give some practical example from my life. After the 24th of February, I had to flee Ukraine, and now I'm based in Spain. So in Ukraine, we have this amazing system which is called DIA. DIA is the app on your phone, and in this app, You have your passport, you have your vaccination certificate, you have your code for tax authorities, the EDP, I don't know how it is called. I can pay my taxes through this DIA. I can send my tax declarations through this DIA. I can change the place of residence through this DIA. I can claim government support from this DIA. I can ask for to calculate my pensions through this DIA. Like, I have the system which I have everything on my phone. When I came to Spain, so I wanted to open the bank account. Like, I still don't have bank account. Then all the issue with the paper documents, if you need some document, you need to go to one institution, then to another, then again to the first one. A lot of signatures, you cannot do it online. You should all the time try to get the appointments from 8 until 10. Then in Spain, they have this fiesta or siesta for 5 hours. So like, I'm really crazy about that. So I have my DIA and I can do everything I need in my phone using, I just need internet, mobile internet, and that's all. So I do believe that we need to work with breaking these stereotypes, which unfortunately are present here in the European Union about the neighboring countries. Because frankly speaking, I'm struggling a lot with all these bureaucratic moments, while, yeah, there's a lot to take from the neighboring countries.
Absolutely, absolutely. For those of you watching, you're watching this event here at the House of European History through the lens and in conjunction with Europe Stories of the University of Oxford. And we're continuing our discussion on what young European citizens would like to see the EU do and be in the future. This is the final session of the day, as we've been talking about all these different aspects about how the EU operates and should operate. And this being the year 2022, being the year of youth. So it's absolutely germane to be talking about this right now. Kristijan, you had something to say here.
One aspect that we haven't touched on, I think, at all so far, and it's very relevant to the enlargement debate as well, is demography. And of course, we can use the demographic realities to make the case for enlargement even more strongly, because even currently, I believe there is, on average, 3 workers per pensioner in the average EU member state. And this number will fall to 2, probably. Demographers are projecting that it will fall to 2 within our lifetimes by 2060 or 2070. So that might seem like, you know, the distant future, but even the current reality of 3 per 1 is already very problematic. So given the pandemic context, European member states are already facing major labor shortages. So we can definitely use that in terms of making the case for enlargement. And if there is one silver lining, I mean, it's an awful phrase, but if there is one important positive takeaway that we can take from the acceptance of Ukrainian refugees by many European countries, is that clearly West European countries and Central European countries are more open to migrants from Slavic countries compared to migrants from the Middle East, as we remember from the previous crisis. So if European Union member states keep facing these labor shortages and demographic challenges, and if they can't boost their own fertility to deal with these challenges, then the only option really is immigration. And that immigration will have to come from mostly from
right, that has to be communicated in the proper way, otherwise the populace will seize on that.
No, there is a downside to that, obviously, but in terms of the economic benefits and how we convince people in those countries about enlargement.
Absolutely. And once again, for those of you, okay, I will look. For those of you watching, please, and those of you here as well, the hashtag Europe Stories and Europe Day is the one to send out when you're tweeting. And please do tweet. I think we have a question coming in. Is that right? Let's take a look. It's on my WhatsApp, right? No? SMS. It's an SMS. Ah, that's why. Okay, all right. Okay, here we go. Message from Panos. Just so we can understand, why are there disagreements between states? We need to respect their different positions. Who would like to answer that? There's obviously, yes, disagreement.
Well, yes,
I mean, and
just
we
like
have
in
to
this
respect
room.
those positions. But
Yes.
how do you do that and make the EU effective so we're not sort of stuck, you know, dead in the water on addressing certain issues?
Yes. Well, yes, it's normal that there is disagreement, and it's healthy that there is disagreement. Conflict is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. Actually, conflict oftentimes brings a higher energy and better progress afterwards. I think what's important in the EU, we've talked a lot about moving from unanimity to qualified majority voting, which indeed would make a lot of things go smoother and faster and more effective and efficient.
That's in the Future of Europe, among the Future of Europe suggestions that will be delivered to the institutions tomorrow.
Yeah,
right?
Great.
Yeah.
But indeed, there is also this exception that for certain important matters, the unanimity prevails. So I think that's how we preserve everyone's different interests, that on certain issues that are very important to everyone, that we say, okay, we all have to agree. But then we also have to make some compromise that sometimes we have to get things moving a bit faster.
Yeah, I mean, because I think, isn't there a danger there of a centrifugal force of some countries, what we saw with Brexit, that there was that perception among voters in the UK that they wanted their autonomy back. And as Marnie, as you were mentioning, what you would like to see is that Europe stays together. How do you address that and yet respect how do you respect the different government opinions and still make this work and keep it together?
I mean, it kind of goes back to some of the discussion we had before. You know, is a top-down, is a centralized authority the way to go? I think we've clearly kind of pushed that to the side because I don't think that's necessarily what we see as the future of the EU. However, there are some issues that we've clearly highlighted where a central authority would work. I mean, it came up in the data that in terms of climate change, having something like an authoritarian regime seems to be more effective, or at least perceived to be more effective. When addressing a conflict like a war in the neighboring country, is a streamlined approach more effective than unilateral? Likely, but again, it's also beyond the EU. Yeah, so I think you're exactly right, though, Sophie. Right, you have to acknowledge that each country is unique and it is different. So you don't want to homogenize the EU as one identity, as one group, because then you are losing what is valuable about countries coming together. Okay,
well, take one concrete example. I just want to pursue this with this idea of sanctions, and there is this real divergence among EU states, countries, on how much we should be cutting off our oil and gas that we're buying from Russia, and a lot of countries are worried about their economies shutting down, like Hungary and so forth, even Germany. How do you address that? How do you try to have an assertive foreign policy and yet respect the opinions of these countries? Now, I see we're finding some way out by giving a little more time, a little more slack to countries like Hungary to deal with that, but is that the way to go? Or do we have to try to how do you get a more assertive foreign policy that way? I don't know, maybe Anna, you can address that.
First of all, I'd like to say that the original question posed by our viewer, it's a classical question about democracy.
Yeah.
Right? How do we disagree and yet move forward?
Yeah.
Right? And the way we do that, well, at least in established democracies on the national level, is through debate, representation, and negotiation.
And that's what we're seeing on the sanctions
Because you
thing,
don't have one party elected representing everyone. There is always disagreement. And the elected party then has to negotiate with the rest the issues that need a clear majority in order to move forward, right? That's how it works.
Yeah.
So let's then ask ourselves the question, okay, why have we seen effective progress in the question of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine? What is different from other issues? And why did we see progress until the financial crisis on those strategic points that Timothy reminded us of? It was because we were clear that the interests were common. Everyone was clear that it worked for them as well as for others. I think disagreements right now exist because the perception is, this works for you, rich country, not for me, poor country. This works for you, poor country, not for me, rich country. For instance, I'm speaking as a Portuguese person
exactly,
who kind of lives that dynamic more intensely. Okay, so I think we need to do a better job at finding the common interest. I know this is a very like mushy kind of answer.
Do you agree with the idea of majority votes on certain things, though?
I'm not sure. My mind is not made up because
negotiation to arrive at a common.
But I do think
decision.
the basics of negotiation are not covered in current discussions. I think we kind of all agreed that we can go on disagreeing. The reason why the pandemic was different, the reason why the war in Ukraine is different, is because a sense of urgency and threat is very much present. We know, and the priorities immediately become clear. And countries that we would never imagine would agree, at least in the initial days. I mean, Hungary, that was a surprise, right? Yeah. So when that is clear, we can act together. And I think we really need to do a better job in countries that really disagree on some issues and don't really see how they can have common interests. It doesn't have to be the same interest, by the way. It could just be, okay, we can concede on that, and then you need to give up this thing that you've been.
So you need some kind of an external threat or some emergency to move things along. Other things like wages and healthcare and education, things like that, that's hard to push a consensus like that, isn't it, Jan?
Well, just to continue the thread with the question of the member state sovereignty and effective decision-making capacity of the European Union, well, it's obviously a question of political theory, and it's also the question of the limits of the liberty within one political system. But we don't have such a problem, for example, within member states, where even the most important decisions are voted with the constitutional majority. So how about we toy with this idea? Because as we identified this issue already during the first and the second panel, the issue of every single member state voting in favor collectively might be a huge impediment for further enlargement. And there are certain politicians in Eastern Europe who would be willing to block, for example, Ukraine's accession to support Putin's wishes and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as a historian, it brings me back a very interesting parallel to the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where there was a law called liberum veto. Okay. So just to briefly say, liberum veto was exactly based on the same grounding that each of the MP had the right to represent its community, and every single vote needed to be passed in a unanimous manner.
How did that work?
Well, it worked with partitions of its neighbors, because effectively at the end of the day, this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not able to process any significant legislation, because there was always one MP who was bought off or corrupted or whatever. So perhaps we could also watch in history what happens if we try to push this issue of individual sovereignty too hard.
How do you respect national rights, national opinions in a union of 27? It's tough. It's tough. And holding those together. And what about, how much was Brexit a wake-up call to that, about respecting national opinions? What do you think, Timothy? Well, I mean, being, not to be an apologist, but okay, all right.
How does it happen in the United States?
Yeah, well, yes, exactly. You reach...
Very different states, okay, there's no language barrier, and by the way, I don't think that's much of a barrier in this day and age. Yeah. But, yeah, I mean, how do well, with language barriers, by the way, how do federations and other types of union, I'm using federation in the broad sense, I should have mentioned that earlier. Yeah. How do they make decisions?
Well, okay, so
how does Switzerland make decisions?
Right,
how
but that's based on a majority vote. So you then majority vote is okay, but you have to negotiate to get there, right? Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, there is still continuing about this discussion. It might be perceived that we have a certain dichotomy here. So we have the central politics versus the national politics.
Yes.
But as Sophie was, for example, talking about this transnational list, maybe this is the way forward to approach the issue from a completely different perspective. I remember the other day we were even discussing the prospects, what would have happened if the president of the commission would be voted on, you know, trans-European manner.
Yeah.
How would that change things?
What's the opinion of, I mean, in your study, is European youth in favor of that, of having a popularly, or a
the president of the commission? Oh, yeah, yeah. And it's also part of the proposals from the Conference on the Future of Europe.
Right? Okay. Yeah. Right, interesting. Lilia, please.
So actually, for me as a non-EU citizen who is still working for the EU project for young people, it seems that the EU is doing not enough in communicating to its own citizens what are the benefits of having the EU, what are the benefits of having the neighborhood policy, and what actually are the results of EU as the Union and of having such policies. Mm-hmm. Because, for instance, earlier today we had a great example of Germany, that German government is a bit reluctant to have some sanctions or to support Ukraine, but thanks to German people, it took some actions. So it is all about communication. So if you communicate to people what are the benefits, why it is really important, then the politics can change. Because politician is a person who is acting in accordance to the benefits like he or she can get from. So if he or she says something which is in line with the public opinion, then that's great. He will get support, everything will be fine. But in order for the public opinion be in favor of the EU or in favor of neighborhood policies, you need to build this public opinion as well. But to build it on facts, based on facts and on the results, on the data. And EU has like amazing results in different areas, especially which deals with freedoms, these four main freedoms. But not everybody knows about these amazing results. We are talking about Erasmus a lot, but you know, I'm now based in Spain in a small village, and actually not all people there know about Erasmus. I am Ukrainian, but I'm much more aware about Erasmus than they, citizens of the European Union.
Yeah, yeah. As a French citizen, I've been also able to work in Germany and now in Belgium. Why? Because of the EU. And I always wanted to make a video showing what if you woke up tomorrow morning and there was no EU. What would happen then? How would that impact? And then you see, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone, like the old song. Yeah. Yes, please.
So on this, I would reframe the question as why is the EU's communication not effective? Because actually, I've had this question, I've discussed this question in different settings many times, and what I've learned is actually the EU invests a lot in communication. There is, I mentioned earlier, I was born in the Azores. I have many friends and family there. One of my friends works at the Europe Direct office in my island, and that's in the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle of nowhere. And there are such offices spread all over the European Union. So there has been an effort. There has been a lot of money invested in communicating well. So why is it not effective? Yeah. Well, we know people are not interested. You were mentioning that earlier. Yeah. Most people are not interested. So why? And I think, I mean, I don't really know what the answer is. I know it has a lot to do with, you know, how do people feel engaged and how they feel like this directly relates to them and has a direct impact on their lives, and that they know how they can be informed and understand what's at stake for them. Yeah,
maybe with this conflict, this war, could makes a lot of Europeans more appreciative. Yeah,
but it's about the fundamentals. The issue comes to, you know, Erasmus, for instance. You know, how do I know about that? How am I aware? For instance, I was going to mention earlier. I don't have the numbers. Oh, yes, I do. So 2 in 5 Europeans actually never travel to other countries within the EU. We have these freedoms. We've actually said or concluded in this project that 3/4 of Europeans think that the EU would not be worth having without freedom of movement, and yet we see that most of them don't, actually in some countries, more than half don't benefit. In Portugal's case, that's the case. 8 EU members the majority of people don't actually use this freedom.
Yeah.
So just to wrap it up, I think the solution has a little bit to do with what Sophie was speaking earlier, you know, when she mentioned the Festival of Europe as a better alternative name to the Conference on the Future of Europe. Why? Because that directly speaks to what people are interested in and how they go about living their lives and what they tend to do with their time and how politics can be more a part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it rings a bell in me on one of Europe's Stories videos of Cem Özdemir. Cem Özdemir is a member of the German parliament who talked about how when he was a youth he was not able to cross borders in the EU because there wasn't Schengen yet. He was a Turkish citizen at the time, but if he were in the EU, he would have been able to travel. So that was a defining moment for him. Anyway, Marnie, please.
Yeah, no, I've had an interesting point that I keep hearing brought up, and I've been trying to jump in. I guess I also have a question for my fellow panelists as someone or people who are in the EU or aspiring to be in the EU. But one common theme, and you've touched on it, it's kind of been implicit, is what does the EU mean for Europeans and for people in the EU? And why is it until a threat comes that we see the relevance of it? And then we have these strategic goals, and we've talked about them, and once we've achieved the goals, it almost seems there's a sense of complacency where we just accept it is what it is, it's normalized, we don't see the value of it until this threat comes, and then we again push back again, so we unify, we come together, and then we wait and it's normalized again until this threat comes again. And so I was curious if my fellow panelists could speak a little bit, because, I mean, Lily has been speaking so highly of the EU, you know, something you aspire to be. In North America, we also see it as setting these really fundamental goals, whether that be around social policy, around environmental policies, and yet within it itself, it doesn't seem necessarily that it's still seen in that way, or it doesn't have that until a common threat is there, then it becomes, or it's just a chance to redefine itself. So I'm curious, I mean, if you guys want to speak to that, if it's seen in the same way as we see it from the outside.
Sure, Jan, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, in the second stage of the project of Europe in a Changing World, we spent a lot of time discussing this and also trying to see how other regions perceive Europe from outside in. But it should be first stated that European identity is not identical towards EU identity. So there are those slight differences, and this becomes especially apparent when we talk about, for example, illiberal democracies, where Viktor Orban might be very well saying that some values of the European Union do not reflect the European tradition of Christianity and other socially conservative-minded initiatives. But essentially, European Union's identity and of the citizens of European Union identity is about the way of life. It's about the preservation of the basic rights of the individual. It's about the liberal attitude, but it's also about welfare provisions. So I guess it's always easier to pinpoint what does it mean to be EU-European when we look at the way of life rather the other way around.
True, true. Sophie, you had something to say, didn't you?
Yes, jumping on what Lydia was saying earlier about people in the EU not knowing about Erasmus, whereas people outside the EU knew about it. So yes, indeed, there is a big issue there. And I perceive it the following way, is that people working at DG Com or people working in the very new strategic communication department, they are people who are already completely convinced about this, right? You don't need to convince them. They have been convinced about this probably their entire life.
They're true believers, yeah.
They're true believers.
Yeah.
And most of the time they are preaching to the converted.
Yes.
It's like the Conference on the Future of Europe. Why would someone who is against the EU overall would be ever interested in joining something like the Conference on the Future of Europe?
Well, it's almost like customer complaints, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead.
So I think there is an issue there because a lot of people who communicate about the EU, for them it's so obvious that they cannot really understand why someone wouldn't be so convinced about all these benefits.
True.
So
how do you address that?
Well, yes. We all need to understand that diversity brings better results. And we were reading this book for another program called Rebel Ideas. It's fantastic, by the way, highly recommended. It shows how diversity and inclusion constantly and consistently brings higher, better results. whether it's at the company level or at national level, in all sorts of ways.
Right.
So when we start seeing diversity as a positive, the beginning of positive results, then we can have a more open-minded mindset. So nobody is ever 100% correct. Nobody is ever 100% wrong. There is always a bit of truth, and there is always a bit of lies in everything. So once we go beyond that and we start listening to each other a bit better, then I think that diversity can be better embraced.
At a Future of Europe festival.
Hopefully.
Anyone else? I have a question coming in now from, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Laura, and I really
Laura.
liked your idea of like, what if tomorrow there's no European Union?
Yeah, we got to make that video.
Yeah, and I really like thought experiments, so I would like to challenge the panel to think what would it be like. So but maybe in like 3 different levels. So the first one is that I'd have to ask for a visa to work here in Brussels. That would be extremely boring, but feasible. Then we could think about the second level, meaning some countries will be poorer, some countries would be richer. Maybe we all end up being poorer, maybe we all end up being richer, I don't know. And then the third one would be an extreme level, like maybe we would stop having peace and having war.
Yeah,
and
ethnic conflicts, border
maybe
disputes.
like trying to think about it this way, we could understand maybe why is it so vital for Ukrainians to want to join the EU. I don't know. Maybe we think it's irrelevant, but I'd like to start this thought experiment. I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, good one, good one. Yes, who would like to? Or you all agree with what she says?
No, I mean, I can jump in with slightly less sophisticated example what would have happened without the EU if we were now, but probably I would have been late for this conference because I would need to pay roaming, and since I want to save up money, I wouldn't have Google Maps, so I will try to figure my way how to reach these premises, and then I will come and say, well, I'm sorry, I forget my map, for example. So you can have this enormously starting with those fundamental issues and then go to those nitty-gritties of getting late and you know, being late for a meeting and not having data on your mobile.
It's all those things we take for granted. Yes, Marnie.
Well, I think something to think about too is likely there could have been the formation of other organizations or other unions or different alliances. And so thinking about that, then why is this more important and what value does this bring? And so why do we not want other, or why do we want this alliance over some other alliance? And I think that's really fundamental to think about, is what does it bring us that the absence of which, you know, why would life be worse, or why would it be different, and what would we not benefit from having it, you know, geopolitics looking a little bit differently?
Yeah, Anna?
This reminded me of something that even Krastev made me think a lot, especially after Brexit, which was, you know, there's a part of Europe that actually has experienced the disintegration of a union. And there's another side of it that can't conceive of it because, you know, we just haven't had that experience. And I've wondered about that loud a couple of times. I think all of the above that you mentioned could very likely happen. I think perhaps most likely because we're kind of too used to or too accustomed to having avenues for negotiation. We'd probably just get together more quickly with the countries we knew we shared more with in terms of not just, you know, heritage, but mainly common interests. Okay, let's align together against that front because we have more in common right now in common interests. I think that's perhaps the most likely scenario. I'd like to also just mention very quickly that there was a kind of experiment in the lines of what you suggested. There was I think it was in Germany after Brexit, there was like this, it was a commercial or something that asked the question, you know, if we left the EU, this is what your supermarket would look like, your local supermarket.
Oh, there was that.
And there was like empty shelves.
Yeah.
Yes, and then I know that that sort of initiative has been replicated around the time of the European elections, parliament elections.
Right. I have a, yes, sir, Kristijan.
Just one very brief answer to that question. At the most kind of existential level, at least 1 million babies wouldn't have been born, because that's the number of babies that have emerged as a result of Erasmus.
The Erasmus babies. It's well known. Erasmus babies. That's right. I have another question coming in. And please do send in your questions via the chat on YouTube. Do you think the war in Ukraine will cause a permanent change in European neighborhood policy by empowering Eastern partnerships? Empowering Eastern partnerships. I'm not sure what they meant by that. I guess making them more important, I guess. Yes? Lilia.
Thanks. This is really a great question. And first of all, we need to talk about the Eastern Partnership. So what it is about. The Eastern Partnership is about cooperation between the 6 states, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, with the EU. And for past few years, there have already been some discussions regarding the Eastern Partnership itself, whether there is such unity between these countries and whether you can actually cover them on this multilateral cooperation, having Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, who show such aspirations, and having Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, situation in which differs a bit. So the war in Ukraine has actually caused another round of discussions, because Ukraine, together with Moldova and together with Georgia, actually got the questionnaire regarding joining the EU. So when we talk about Eastern Partnership, I would like the war to strengthen it, but there are some other discussions as well around it. So first of all, my personal opinion is that within this Eastern Partnership, there are already some unions which are existing and which are actually showing more eagerness to join the EU. But it doesn't mean the Eastern Partnership doesn't work as a concept. It means that still we have diversity. It is as in the European Union. We have different countries, we have diversity, we have different approaches. So I would like to say that Eastern Partnership as a concept and as a union, it will exist from my point of view, and the war in Ukraine will show again this unity between the Eastern partner countries, because Ukraine has got a lot of support from Moldova, from Georgia, as well, even from like some further countries. If we talk about Azerbaijan and Armenia, but in general, there are some disproportionalities, which doesn't mean that the concept is not working. It means that the concept can have some another modalities, but it will continue working successfully.
And it's basically an aid and trade relationship, right?
A bit.
Eastern Partnership, and it was perceived by some, especially on the Russian side, as being a provocation of encroaching, of the EU encroaching on Russia's near abroad. But maybe, I guess the question then is, because of this war, does this maybe empower that relationship, that there's less reluctance to go ahead with something like that because of this war? What do you think, Jan?
I mean, I wanted to refer to the notion of Brexit and Project Fear. So not sure if we're changing.
Do that and answer the question.
Yeah, because we talked a lot about the resilience and empowering our neighborhood policy. But if we learned anything from Brexit at all, is that the arguments based on factual notion are not effective, and in this post-truth world, it's about the emotions. And obviously, the timing of Brexit was not particularly helpful for European Union. It just emerged after a series of very difficult crises, with from the fiscal one to the migrant one. But I think that essentially the problem was that emotionally, Brexit idea was more compelling. Yeah, you said take back control, stability, something dignified. But what could have you counteracted it from the EU Remain perspective? The problem is that we need to create a narrative where EU is cool again. If you look, for example, on the way the EU was perceived by Eastern Europe in the 90s as the promise of something better, something cool, this is probably a roadmap. And we actually see it with Ukrainian narrative of EU nowadays. Yeah, more than 90% perceive this union of ours that is really cool. So if we try to address EU being cool again to younger generation, we should still think about the festivals, about traveling, about roaming, about Erasmus babies, but carefully, obviously. So I think that those things still matter when we package them for younger generation.
Okay, I'm advised that we're, I think, out of time shortly, right? But we want to get a couple more questions and comments in. Please.
So I also work for the Europe Stories project, and I have a question related to EU foreign policy. So in the morning we were discussing these two somewhat competing narratives of what European agency in the world could look like, you know, different ideas of a European superpower. In the report we introduced or put forward the idea of a green civilian superpower, kind of versus the sort of more traditional hard power geopolitical actor. Now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the war in Ukraine, many people are reconsidering aspects of that traditional hard power aspect in terms of security, investment to the military. And I think Jan very briefly touched upon that point, how, you know, that can be in conflict with our civilian, with the civilian aspect of our green civilian superpower. And I would like you to reflect also a little bit about the conflict that this might cause with the green aspect of our green civilian superpower vision, obviously, because arms industry is not a particularly green industry, which is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. It's not only about supply chains and the production methods, but of course the consequences, the implementation of these arms, the destruction of complete ecosystems during war also poses a big problem. So yeah, I would like you to reflect, because I see another problem on the horizon, you know, that will come with that.
Who would like to take that briefly? Don't all jump at once. Anna, you were going to make a comment, and can you integrate that in your answer, please?
I'm not sure. I have to think a little bit more, but I would like to say something. If I go away without, if I really wanted to say something, it's this, and it's, thank you very much for your question, by the way. To sum it up, because there's a lot I could say, and I could see, I think there were valid points in the Brexit campaign. I mean, we always hear the critical side of it. I think there were valid points, and I was quite frustrated with the attitude from the European Union and the Remainers of just like kind of taking it for granted that it was obvious that there was no alternative, Tina. And I think that approach has hurt us. I think, you know, just like Churchill said about democracy, it's the worst system except for all the rest. We need not to say this is the only alternative, but it is the best alternative compared to all the others, given the circumstances we're in. So I could expand, but we're out of time, but I just wanted to say that. Yeah. Yes,
I am so sorry. I think we do need to wrap this up. Thank you so much to all of you for being here, to our speakers, also to Timothy, and to all of you watching for being a part of this. You can also, this is also recorded, I guess. It's going to be watched later as well here at the House of European History, hearing the voices of youth. And in this critical moment, as we talked about today, our thanks to the House of European History, also to Europe Stories, and yes, hashtag Europe Day, hashtag Europe Stories. My name is Chris Burns. Thanks for joining us. See you next time. Thank you.